Hello and welcome to all the men and women of the West, and happy Hobbit Day. I'm Joe, and here with me is my co-host Dan.
Hello and greetings. Where others have preferred to discuss friendship as a theme, we've chosen to avoid that theme if only to discuss something else that caught our eye, namely the Scouring of the Shire and the thematic role it plays in The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings. For most, there's a particular view that the Shire is something of an utopia. Crime is low, conflict non-existent. Outside of gossip, there's nothing really wrong with the place. What should be noted is the softness prevalent in the culture and how similar it is to modern England. To say that hobbits are an anachronism for a modern Englishman would be to repeat what has been said 1,000 times already by every person who's ever studied Tolkien and his legendarium in the past half century or so. The hobbits, for their part, do carry some measure of difference from Englishmen, as they seem almost fearful or otherwise hostile to what lies beyond the boundaries of the Shire. Not exactly something one could associate with the adventurous, far-wandering English of Tolkien's day, let alone any other era. And while the hobbits fear the outside world and dare not tread outside, they do, however, have a close-knitted, almost familial sense of loyalty to one another. This bond that ties them to one another, with the only real outlying incidences before the end of The Lord of the Rings being the glee with which Bilbo's home was raided at the end of The Hobbit, or how fights broke out over some of his property after the party at the start of The Lord of the Rings. These are the only hints of a darker side lying below the surface, and it is this darker, less than civilized side that is what is so interesting, as it is evident that Sam, Frodo, Merry, and Pippin all share it on some level, if in slightly more muted measure at a few points in the story. But that's enough prevaricating on the topic. It is time to get into the actual scouring. The Scouring of the Shire is, for those not familiar with it, the chapter in the story when the Shire is taken over by Saruman, who turns the countryside Shire into a place of technological progress and a place of fear. The Industrial Revolution that follows tears much of the region apart and sees the hobbits, who are so accustomed to such a decentralized society, now come face to face with a fairly dystopian society. The first hint of just how far the hobbits have fallen as a society comes with the mention of the chief and how the sheriffs, the police force of sorts of the Shire, dictate to Frodo where he can and cannot go. The peaceful hobbit is keen to do as he is bidden, though his friends are not, with the sheriffs escorting him to one of the barracks after mentioning that the local tavern was closed down. Quite why isn't explained, but given the nature of societies that tend to lean towards regarding such closures as necessary, one could surmise it has to do with Saruman's need for control. He also outlawed pipeweed, yet hoarded it for himself, as he was fairly addicted to it. This sort of hypocrisy isn't a contradiction for leaders of such movements and societies that prize technological advancements and such above all else, or so Tolkien is likely commenting. But the fact that the hobbits have agreed to this demonstrates their own corruptibility, their inherent fallen nature, one might venture to say. The next major plot point worth pointing out is that Otho was formally elevated to a top position. He's laughed at and treated as little more than a nominal leader, with the real one being Saruman himself as Sharky, despite with which Sharky behaved himself in the Shire, turning it into an industrial wasteland simply to avenge himself against the hobbits, is something that startles them. But the worst part of his misdeeds and crimes there is that it forced the hobbits to commit that which they had not committed in centuries: violence. Whether you like it or not, a war to liberate the Shire of this madness is opening a can of worms that can never be fully closed. But that said, who can argue against its necessity? The fact is, the solution in this situation was almost as bad as the disease.
The truth is that the civilized approach had availed the hobbits nothing. If anything, it is likely this very side of the hobbits that made them so easy to corrupt. And corrupt them for a time, Saruman did. And it was by preying upon their need for order, for luxury and ease, that he convinced them to go along with his technological advancements, though they were wholly unnecessary. It is here I must confess that when reading this chapter, there is another author who looms large in my mind when reading it, Robert E. Howard. Yep, Tolkien's Texan counterpart, the creator of Conan the Cimmerian, had a very different philosophy from that of Tolkien's regarding the nature of modernity. Tolkien was no fan of it, whereas Howard positively disliked it and regarded it as a temporary thing and barbarism as inevitable. This chapter is a case in point, one could argue, of the philosophy archetypal story he tended to put forward when writing Conan. Namely that when a civilization grew to become decadent, it is the barbarian archetype character who shows up to clean up the mess and restore the core values of the society to them. That is to say, whenever Conan wanders by a kingdom, it is because it is in peril and in need of him to fight for it and to show them what they could be so that they aspire to honor their ancestors who built the state they live in. In the case of the Shire, the argument can be made that the hobbits had long since fallen from reason and virtue with their dystopian society. It was why it was so necessary that they resort to barbarism to fight back against Saruman. One can argue that they soon became a little too enthusiastic for blood, the core of their civilization being one that was founded on the overcoming of hardship, not the hiding from it, as one can clearly see in the of Hobbit's essay, which details how they arrived in the Shire, the memories of which is not simply engraved in their histories, but coded also into their DNA, so to speak. They thus had to resort to a tradition older than that of the Shire to rescue the Shire, namely their roots. No society is ever built solely upon peace, and no civilization can be defended via peace, with it requiring legions and centurions to defend herself. It is only by returning to their core of strength that can be found in their barbaric roots were they able to overcome the weakness invited in by what Howard might have termed over-civilization. Some might question the wisdom of such an analysis, but the truth is negotiation and compromise left the Shire open to Saruman's takeover. It was only by battle and savagery that they could reclaim their homes and their place in the Shire. If they had, say, invited the Rangers in to solve their problems, they would have inevitably been drawn deeper into the affairs of the kingdom of the Númenóreans, and thus would have lost the isolation and civilization that they had worked so hard to build up over the course of many centuries. Does this mean that this story becomes less Tolkienian and more Howardian, so to speak, in nature? Not at all. It is still firmly entrenched in Tolkienian ideas, just that there is a blending of the Howard in there, if one cares to look. The Tolkienian shines through in the character of Frodo Baggins. Where Conan might well solve the problem of Saruman violently, Frodo seeks at first to deal with the situation calmly, relying upon his friends to assemble a force to assist him in the battle against the Old Maiar. In the aftermath of the battle between their forces, Frodo seeks to show mercy to his defeated foe, an act of mercy that is reminiscent of Conan's act of pity towards Tarascus at the end of the Hour of the Dragon. The sole difference, though, is that Saruman has done far, far more to deserve less pity, which is a testament to Frodo's good character, as he's been broken by the One Ring and its destruction by this time. It is fascinating how, in marked contrast to his fellow hobbits, who have no wish to show pity towards Saruman, Frodo is insistent on this point. His persistent belief in Gandalf's philosophy of not judging another man is what secured victory over the One Ring. It shan't be denied, yet in the case of the Shire, it is impossible to say that it yielded much results other than shielding the hobbits from a semi-sacrilegious act, as the slaying of a Maiar would indeed be this sort of abomination, an act that could have some measure of dire repercussions in some way for the hobbits. A balance was required for them, with this incident serving to highlight the importance of Frodo and the growth he had over the course of the novel. At the start of the book, he had spoken of how he thought that Bilbo should have slain Gollum, and he meant it, with Gandalf scolding him about passing sentence on others too hastily. Over the course of The Lord of the Rings, he changes his views. By the end of the book, Frodo is a firm believer in Gandalf's school of philosophy that pity and mercy ought to be practiced at every opportunity. That said, if we had entertained the possibility that Saruman had lived, he would doubtless have lived up to his vow to cause more sorrow and pain for the free people of Middle-earth, especially the hobbits, so that in time, Frodo would have learnt to regret his actions in some measure, as his mercy would, no matter what, come back to haunt him. Thankfully, Grima took things into his own hands, and it is here that it is a great pity that the hobbits let their anger overtake them as they shot the ladder full of arrows. This latter tragedy is the greater of the two, because, like it or not, Grima Wormtongue was utterly broken by this time. He could not have caused much more harm after this, at least not to the degree he once could, and did. In all, this is both proof of the importance of some measure of barbarism, lest one gives way to the indolences of civilization, something that all should be aware of, as it is a gluttonous beast, but at the same time, one shouldn't be won over by savagery and violence. As the best proof of the balance, one could argue, would be the likes of Gondor and Rohan, with the hobbits both also proof of this ideal, and also a stark warning at the end of the dangers of what can happen if one gives way to too much civilization and too much barbarism. If this video entertained you, you're encouraged to imitate the hobbits of the Shire and show little in the way of pity or mercy towards the like and subscribe buttons. Also, do feel free to check out the other videos in this excellent playlist.